Today, I am joined by members of my administration and members of the community to provide an important public safety update. I also want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Councilmember Charles Allen, who chairs the Council's Committee on Public Safety in the Judiciary. I want to share some data with you and talk to you also about a new approach that we will take to dealing with gun violence in Washington, D.C. For the past year, many communities across the district have been burdened by two simultaneous public health emergencies. The first is the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit our Black and Latino communities the hardest. The second is the gun-related violence that continues to devastate many of the same communities. Last year, we had 200 people in our city who were victims of homicide, and over 900 people were shot. This is a level of violence that we haven't seen in more than a decade. And the homicide trends are disturbing when you, of course, look at the sheer number and also look at how they are devastating blocks and neighborhoods and families across the district. Nearly 96% of homicide victims in our city last year were Black. Many of the victims were young, most victims younger than 40, and 11 victims not yet 17 years old, still children. We remember baby Carmelo, just 1 year old, shot and killed in his car seat. Davon McNeil, just 11 years old, when he was shot and killed on the 4th of July. We remember all of the lives taken far too soon, and we remember them as beautiful children, loving parents, loyal friends, caring husbands and boyfriends. These losses inflict pain and trauma on so many people. Parents have buried their children. Children are growing up without parents, and our community is suffering. We all understand the urgency to reverse these trends so that we can save lives. But we know that we must act, and we must act differently. And that is why today I am signing a mayor's order that recognizes gun violence as a public health crisis and creates a first of its kind gun violence prevention emergency operations center to coordinate the government resources necessary to better support our residents and communities most impacted by gun violence. This is an important part of a larger initiative that we are calling Building Blocks DC. The Gun Violence Prevention EOC, which will be headquartered right here in Shannon Place, will coordinate the development of a long-term strategy to reduce gun violence by focusing on the most at-risk people and places with a nimble, coordinated whole government approach. In signing this order, I am charging Linda Harley Harper, our newly appointed Director of Gun Violence Prevention, with assembling a team of the best and brightest in DC government in emergency management, education, and job training, mental health, housing, and government services to staff the EOC and lead Building Blocks DC. Like our COVID-19 response, Building Blocks DC will incorporate a whole government approach that allows us to focus our resources where they will have the greatest impact. I want to thank the many community advocates who have worked tirelessly to address gun violence and the trauma it inflicts on DC residents. I want to thank the City Administrator, Kevin Donahue, the former Deputy Mayor, Dr. Roger Mitchell, and our Acting Deputy Mayor for Public Safety, Chris Geltart, and of course, Director Harley Harper for all the work that they have and that they will do to develop and stand up Building Blocks DC and the Gun Violence Prevention EOC. I look forward to working with our council members as well, who are also keenly focused on how to save lives in DC, to help provide the necessary support to sustain and build upon this effort. Now I want to ask Director Harley Harper to share some details about the EOC, and then we will have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Mayor Bowser. Good morning.
Good morning.
Today's announcement of Building Blocks DC, and specifically Gun Violence Prevention Emergency Operations Center, is the first of its kind in the country to address gun violence using a public health approach. It is a comprehensive, community-oriented approach that focuses on the circumstances that put people at high risk of engaging in or being victimized by violence. We want to focus on people, places, and process. First, we're serving people by focusing on meeting the needs of the small number of individuals responsible for a large amount of gun violence in our city. Second, we're co-creating safe places by focusing on the small number of places where most of the gun violence is occurring in our communities. Third, we're improving processes and building sustainability by creating an emergency operations center to coordinate and enhance violence prevention efforts already underway by many district agencies, nonprofit organizations funded by the district government, and community-led efforts. Building Blocks DC serves as the foundation of citywide efforts to work with Washingtonians as partners in reducing gun violence in our city. As the mayor said, Building Blocks DC will be taking a whole-of-government approach in partnership with our most impacted communities to address the urgent needs of our residents. We will be connecting our residents with trauma-informed services, stable housing, employment, and other critical supports, recognizing the impact and the ripple impact of gun violence on our residents and on our impacted communities. We'll be doing this in partnership and with the voice and input of our communities and stakeholders as part of the process. Through Building Blocks DC, we'll be creating an infrastructure and process to coordinate collective action. We know that in the district, a very small number of persons are participating in violent and dangerous behaviors. Focusing energy and resources on this specific population will yield results. We also know that hurt people and communities, and we will work to engage those who have historically been disconnected in services, supports, and opportunities. We will engage people most at risk of becoming a victim or perpetrator of gun violence and focus our initial engagement efforts on those persons. Through the EOC, we will learn a lot about the behaviors and needs of these focused persons, and we will work in partnership with those already in relationship with these persons to tailor individualized service delivery to this population. We will meet them where they are with the goal of supporting them in their own positive transformation. For residents in these neighborhoods, and for those already working on the ground in our communities, we want you to notice a more consistent, coordinated community response around government and social service delivery. But our heavy lifting, working one-on-one with the most impacted residents, will happen through direct engagement with those individuals and their families. Together, these actions will elevate communities' voices and build trust in government-supported programs and assistance. Using last year's crime data, we know that 2% of all blocks in the city were the site of 41% of all gunshot-related crimes last year. We will initially focus on those areas. This place-based strategy is a data-driven approach that uses a comprehensive block-by-block analysis to pinpoint specific areas where gun violence is a constant reality and the sounds of gunshots are a regular event. We analyze this data based on violent offenses like homicides, robberies, and assaults where shots were fired and sounds of gunshot calls for service to 911. We will be launching this new strategy here in the heart of historic Anacostia, where we have already established a baseline of support through Families First DC, the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, their Violence Intervention Program, and MPD's Summer Crime Initiative. This initial coordination of services and opportunities will support the broader response developed and delivered through Building Blocks DC. We know reducing gun violence will require sufficient resources, both in terms of people and funding. I am so excited to share this morning that Mayor Bowser will be making a $15 million down payment on Building Blocks DC, with additional funding to come as part of the fiscal year 2022 budget. This funding will provide the kind of supports and opportunities that we've discussed, like housing, job and career readiness training, violence prevention, mental health care, and the Emergency Operations Center. I'd like to now bring forward Chris Geldart, Acting Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, an expert in emergency operations and response, to share more about the phased approach of the gun violence EOC.
Thank you, Director Harper, Mayor Bowser, and our council members that are here with us today supporting this effort. We're standing up this Emergency Operations Center. We're building an adaptive and evolving process is what we're looking at doing to expeditiously, in a whole of government way, as been mentioned before, to implement this Building Blocks DC process. We've discussed the Building Blocks DC is a deliberative public health approach to gun violence prevention, but it's very nimble in its approach, as will be evidenced in how we operate it here in the Emergency Operations Center. Right now we're launching Building Blocks DC in 3 blocks in the neighborhoods here. As we explained, to launch the other blocks across the district, we know that community needs will vary. The important piece of what we do in an Emergency Operations Center is look at what's being effective and what needs to adapt as we go forward, just as we did in the coronavirus EOC, as we looked at how everything morphed and changed and evolved through that whole process. I want to thank Dr. Roger Mitchell, our former interim deputy mayor for Public Safety and Justice and chief medical examiner, and Manon Butler, the executive director of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, for their willingness to serve as co-chairs for Building Blocks DC Scientific and Expert Advisory Board. This advisory board will help us have good, solid information to go off of and be able to vet the information that we are looking at as we go through this process of moving the building blocks throughout the city. And this team will ensure that our approach remains data informed, is implementing the best practices, and is using the right metrics to track our progress. I also want to thank Reverend Donald Isaacson, Executive Director of the DC Corrections Information Council, and Tony Lewis, advocate and reentry expert, who will serve as co-chairs for our Community Advisory Board. This team will bring forward community voices and concerns to continuously inform our program approach to support the Gun Violence Prevention Emergency Operations Center. Both of these groups will be pivotal to us in ensuring that we have the voices of the community and a scientific approach to what we're doing. Working together, we believe Building Blocks DC will help us improve outcomes for our residents most impacted by gun violence, initiating a sustained connection to services and opportunities. We are also challenging ourselves as a government to change their places by tackling solvable neighborhood identified nuisances like trash removal, street light repair, vacant abandoned buildings, and the detritus that we know that we can affect when we focus our city services. And we're doing it all by engaging residents, community-based organizations, advocates, elected officials, and government in building public safety solutions that lead to a lasting change. Thank you, ma'am. That's all I have.
I should mention that our council member for Ward 8, Councilmember Trayon White, is also here. I'm sorry I didn't see you in the beginning, Councilmember White. And at this time, I'll ask the council members if they want to make any comments, and then I'll take your questions. Councilmember Allen.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mayor. This is a big deal. This is a big deal today because I believe that this is a incredibly important step for our city. And I think what it does is it is telling the city that violence is not inevitable. And looking at the success and the hard work that the city has put in from a COVID response, there's no better comparison or metaphor to what an EOC can do. Focusing, smart, strategic, and coordinated approach to reducing gun violence across our city. This is something that I think is incredibly important for our city and can have significant and important impacts that absolutely save lives. I know when I looked at my colleague from Ward 8, Trayon White, these are the types of issues that we've talked about at the council, and it's something that we share a strong shared sense of purpose and goal to make sure we're protecting our residents and all of our neighbors. It's an all hands on deck approach that really targets, as you heard, a small number of individuals, but it takes both a place-based and a person-based approach to reducing gun violence, but brings the full weight and support of the city into this. And I mentioned this to the mayor before, but as we have our new gun violence prevention director, Linda Harley Harper, I think it's a outstanding and inspired choice to lead this. She's somebody who has deep credibility as a veteran of DC government, but also has deep credibility in communities in which she works. And so I know that she's going to need our support. I know that I'm looking forward to work with her, but I'm very proud of the steps we're taking today. I'm really looking forward to the coordinated and strong approach that's coming forward, again, at the end of the day, to recognize gun violence and violence is not inevitable. And I believe that this type of work is what's going to prove that, and at the end of the day is going to make our city and our neighborhoods safer and more just. And thank you, Ms. Mayor.
So first I want to thank our Mayor Muriel Bowser for leadership on this issue, the Deputy Mayor Gail Dodd, Linda Holly Hopper, Dale, Chief Conti, and all, and Dr. Roger Mitchell as well, because he was very integral in seeing this come forward. I just feel like as a leader of this community, we've been long overdue for a comprehensive strategy and input from the government that pushes it down to the community. And I've been talking about that for 15 years. But it's important that we utilize the government resources, which is a now $17 billion budget, to ensure that we provide wraparound services, mental health services, and care. I think about the young man, Delonte, who lost his life this morning in Butler Gardens, and so many over the last couple of days and years. And we look at the number of 922 people shot in D.C. last year. We cannot go on business as usual. And so I'm looking forward to working with my council colleagues, Mayor Bowser, and the executive branch, and the community, because government can't do it alone. We have to get people from the community involved in this, and we can't leave it upon just to the Metropolitan Police Department, because there's people in the community who have resources, who have organizations, who have ideas that want to get involved in addressing the gap in achievement in education and health disparities and wealth in our city. And so I'm excited about the inclusivity of this process and look forward to saving lives, because at the end of the day, we know it's affecting black people in this city. I heard the mayor say 90%, and for me, I'm tired of doing the visuals and the funerals every other day in this city that raised me, because I think to myself, one day it may be me or my child, and it hits home directly. And I think that we all in the community have a responsibility to decreasing gun violence in our city, and if not now, then when? And I just want to thank the mayor for stepping up, and I look forward to the leadership of Linda Harley Hopper. I know she's been in the game since I've been doing violence intervention, and I ain't gonna say her age now, but we're excited to have her leading in this role, and just the possibilities of getting community more involved today. So I want to thank you, Mayor Bowser, for your leadership.
And Councilmember, I want to thank you too for always being in the community and speaking for the community. And you have my commitment to make sure that we're going to do everything possible to keep people alive and to make sure that they have positive options for their lives. You mentioned a young man that was killed on Butler Street, and he was a person, and he was in a place that will be targeted by this initiative. And so we know, there's probably more that we will learn, but we know that we can target people who are vulnerable in places that are known to be hotspots for violence and have a positive impact. Councilmember Allen mentioned and Chris mentioned how this mirrors an emergency operation that we would use in a natural disaster or a public health disaster like COVID. We've used other whole government approaches to do big things as well, like build 8 new short-term family housing centers and close DC General. We know that it takes the best and brightest to be focused on it 100% of the time and to fund it accordingly. And so we look forward to getting to work. Any questions? Yes, Sam.
Yes, Mayor. So, Mayor, just curious why this particular neighborhood was chosen. I guess the focus is just going to be here initially. Is that my understanding?
Initially, but when I say initially, it's a quick initially. We want the team to have to get to gel, to get in place, and to test the process. And when they're able to do that, then the additional neighborhoods. We've identified the top 151 blocks that meet the criteria of having a certain number of gunshots or homicides or other violent crime.
Okay, and how are you going to evaluate the effectiveness once you get going? And then one other question, what is the ONE's office role in this? Because it seems like it's sort of the same thing.
The ONE's office and all of our violence interruption programs are part of it. We fund in the millions of dollars violence interruption programs, including in the Office of the Attorney General. And I've tasked Linda with making sure that those programs are running the way they should be running and that they are accountable for results as well. So just like we did in the COVID, as we do with COVID, we will develop the metrics that we can consistently support, but we're at the start of that process.
So you mean you'll be issuing let's say, a report on how well you're doing? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but I wouldn't call it a report. I would call it continuous reporting.
Sort of like with the COVID situation where you talk about...
Not exactly, because we don't have the metrics to follow yet, but we will.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Mark.
So I guess just following up on that, so we might see some type of a dashboard where at a glance we can go in and see the metrics that the EOC is churning and what they're finding?
Yes.
Okay. And then can you identify, you've given us the first 3 blocks, I guess. Can you give us the other 149, 48 blocks? I mean, is that...
We will at some point, Mark, issue like a map, but we're not at that stage yet.
Can you tell us, are they all east of the river, or are they clustered, or can you give us, I mean, I guess we could probably go on to crime maps and see where most shootings
Yes.
are, obviously.
Well, and you've heard from Councilmember White and others, we know that there are communities in Ward 7 and 8 that have the preponderance of gun activity. And there are other blocks in the city, but the preponderance is in Ward 7 and 8.
And then could we hear from Chief Conti, what will the police department's role be? Will people see more officers on the streets in these neighborhoods, or is that counter to what you're trying to do? I'm just wondering, we have them here, I'm just wondering
Sure.
what MPD's role will be in this.
Sure.
Thank you for that question, Mark. Our role is to support Linda in her efforts. I think this is something that the city has cried out for years. It's something that the residents want to see, a government-coordinated effort, and MPD has a role to play in that. There will be some individuals that we will try to touch without other government resources that may not want those resources. And I think as part of that ecosystem, the Metropolitan Police Department has a law enforcement role that we must fulfill to ensure the safety and security of the residents and visitors to the District of Columbia.
More officers on these streets that we see?
It depends. In some areas, it could call for that. I mean, some residents may respond to some of the initial efforts that take place, but certainly if there's gun violence or continued gun violence and there's a requirement or need for law enforcement or additional law enforcement presence, some neighborhoods may see an increased presence.